Hi, my name is Kobe Lund, and I'm going to talk about functional assessment of problem behavior and subsequent planning for behavior intervention plans or behavior support plans, kind of depending on where you're working. Before I get into the details, let me just sort of talk briefly and generally about what a functional behavior assessment is. And a little bit about what it's designed to do. So in and of itself, it's a tool toward design of effective programming. Basically, and before I go any further, I should mention some of you may be familiar with the term functional behavior assessment, or you may have heard functional behavioral assessment. Frankly, you'll see it described as both in different places. In fact, even in the IDEA legislation, it's referred to as both. So there's a place where there's an AL at the end, and there are places where there isn't. So it's probably okay to use either term. In the behavioral literature, it's usually described as a functional assessment of problem behavior. Usually you'll just hear people say FBA, so they'll use the acronym. That's a good way around it. In either case, an FBA or functional behavior assessment is an assessment of the relationship or the functional relationship between a person's behavior and his or her environment. So my environment includes the things around me, the people around me, the way the people around me respond to the things that I do, both positively and negatively, and all of those things affect the future likelihood of all the behaviors in which I engage. And this assessment is basically looking at the functional relationship between those things. How does my behavior or do my behaviors affect the behaviors of people around me, and vice versa. And then if you look at the second bullet point, the reason to do that is that treatment strategies are then identified based on the function of behavior, not the form of the behavior. So when someone asks me, how should I respond to physical aggression or self-injury, or I have a student who won't participate in work or starts yelling when demands are presented, what should I do? Well, the answer to that question depends more on the function of the behavior rather than the form. So things like aggression or self-injury or yelling, tantruming, all the sorts of behaviors that might impede progress, those are really descriptions of form. And we shouldn't design intervention based on form. There's not a perfect consequence for physical aggression. The perfect consequence for physical aggression depends on why it's occurring. How does it function? This person's engaging in a particular behavior. What is the function of that behavior? And that should drive treatment, not form. And that's different than most people think about behavior. And in fact, in most school systems and agencies and organizations, people typically design behavior plans based on the form of behavior. And they're often done sort of arbitrarily. So this is an assessment that allows us to design intervention, to design behavior plans in a way that increases the likelihood of them being effective if they're based on function. And for those of you who may be interested in more details, you can see in smaller print under that second point there, really the seminal research article on functional analysis, and I'll talk more about the kind of distinction between assessment and analysis. But this research study done by Brian Iwata and others was really one of the first times where there was a comprehensive approach taken toward analyzing a variety of functions and using that analysis to design treatment. And this certainly wasn't the first case where behavior analysts started thinking about function. That had been done before. This was the first time that this had been applied in a comprehensive manner. And so for those of you fellow nerds out there, you can access this article. And then lastly, I should just mention that the majority of research in the field of functional analysis has been done in applied behavior analysis. So at this point, there are literally hundreds of research studies that look at this particular area, and most of which have been done in applied behavior analysis. So you can certainly pursue this much further if you like. Okay, so let's start getting into some of the details. With regard to a functional behavior assessment, there are really several levels at which you can do this. And at the most basic level, you have indirect assessments. These include things like interviews. These include if I talk to a teacher or a parent or a caregiver or a paraprofessional or a particular therapist. Tell me about this student's behavior. What does he or she do? Talk to me more about that. What does it look like? What are some patterns associated with this behavior? When is it most likely to occur? If I were to say to you, you know what, I'd really like to see this, get it to happen right now. What would you do? How would you get this behavior to occur? Would you place a demand on the student? Would you set the fire alarm off? Those are patterns. This is an antecedent that typically leads to this behavior. And more importantly, tell me about what generally happens afterward. So when this student engages in this particular behavior, how do you respond? What are the outcomes of this behavior? So there may be situations where outcomes aren't related to any particular sort of quote-unquote discipline by an adult, right? I may be able to escape or avoid or access sensory stimulation that's irrelevant to the adults who are with me. Or in a classroom, I might be able to access peer attention regardless of what an adult or regardless of how an adult responds to my behavior. So on an indirect level of assessment, I can talk to people who know this student about their experiences. And I can gather information that way. Clearly, this is anecdotal information. It's not always going to be accurate. Anecdotal information is notoriously inaccurate and skewed and biased. So this is a level of assessment that you probably wouldn't want to do on its own. For some students who don't exhibit too much behavior or maybe fairly minor behavior, this might be enough, right? This might be a good place to get started. But certainly for students who exhibit dangerous behavior or frequent behavior, or their behavior interferes significantly with their progress, this is probably not enough. Also on this indirect level of assessment, we have things like questionnaires and rating scales. And there are a number of rating scales that you can use, the QABF or the FAST or the MAS, and these can all be valuable ways to collect more information efficiently. So rating scales, questionnaires, these are things that you can send home or send to instructional staff and have them complete and send back to you. And they do provide more information. Some are even designed to sort of point you to function. So they're often good to include in an assessment, but again, I probably wouldn't rely solely on them for any significant behaviors. This may be a good place to start in many cases for many of you and for many of your students. But bear in mind that they're notoriously inaccurate. Then we also have a level that's often described as descriptive. And this starts to get a little bit more intensive. So you're starting to collect more accurate information, but it also often requires more resources. And at a descriptive level, you have things like direct observations, right? So if I'm conducting an FBA on a student, then I would certainly want to see him or her in relevant environments, right? So if this is for a school system, I might do it at home and maybe also school and vice versa. But I want to see what this student does. I want to see this behavior. I want to see what happens before and what happens after. Also at this level, it's appropriate to collect information that's often referred to as ABC data. An ABC is an acronym for antecedent behavior consequence, and we'll talk about this in more detail later. But basically, this is collecting objective information over time about your target behaviors or your behaviors of interest, and recording what are the frequently occurring antecedents to these behaviors, and what are the frequently occurring consequences. So in other words, if physical aggression is one of our target behaviors, each time this occurs, what happened right before? Or what seemed to cue this physical aggression? What seemed to sort of set this off? And then just as importantly, if not more importantly, what happened right afterward? So what was the consequence of physical aggression or consequences of physical aggression? And over time, as I collect this information, it can help me identify patterns. And that's part of doing a good functional assessment. Now, I can tell you that in most cases, particularly in school environments, both in brick and mortar and cyber academy environments, these first two levels will probably constitute the majority of your initial functional assessments. So you may certainly have kids who exhibit more or more severe behavior and sort of need a more intensive level of assessment. Or you may have kids who you start at this level and they don't seem to be responding to intervention, and therefore you need to sort of bump it up. But for many kids in many situations, using a variety of these first tools that I've mentioned, you can do a pretty adequate assessment and design pretty good intervention. And I'm going to talk more about how to do that. But there are certainly some kids who, for whom these tools and these levels of assessment are not adequate. Particularly if their interfering behavior is more severe, more dangerous, more frequently occurring, and they don't seem to be responding to treatment that you've already implemented. In those cases, there's another more intensive level of assessment that's often referred to as functional analysis. And this is an experimental assessment. So in essence, an experimental assessment of behavior includes a controlled manipulation of those consequences or antecedents and consequences in an attempt to isolate their effects on your target behavior. And I won't go into this in a lot of detail because this is probably something that it would require some special planning and expertise. But in essence, a functional analysis or an experimental assessment includes designing several conditions, each of which is specifically controlled to look at different functions of behavior, including things like attention, escape avoidance, access to tangible reinforcement, things like automatic reinforcement or control. And in each one of those conditions, that specific consequence is applied each time a target behavior occurs, and then you compare the different conditions and see if there are differences. Again, this is probably not something that a training such as this is adequate to really get everybody up to speed on that. So for those students who need this level of assessment, that probably requires a little bit of extra support. But it is also a level of assessment. We're going to talk mostly about the indirect and descriptive. And before I get into that, I should mention that there has been, particularly in the last few years, but even a little bit further back than that, some direct comparisons of functional analysis and these indirect and descriptive assessments of behavior. And what is often a result of that research is that the first several methods that I mentioned tend to overestimate function. So they're not necessarily usually wrong, but they might identify 3 functions for a target behavior when a functional analysis might just indicate 1. So this is sort of anecdotal in nature, but I think it's fair to say that functional analysis tends to be much more precise. It certainly requires more expertise and resources, but the results of comparisons suggest that it's certainly more accurate and more precise. And one could certainly make the argument that that would allow a sort of more efficient allocation of resources when it comes to treatment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that your initial plans that are built on indirect and descriptive tools for assessment won't be effective. So for many of your students, those can be useful tools. So let's talk about what those look like. Okay, so when you do a functional assessment, and when you use these indirect and descriptive tools to do your assessment, what you're assessing or what you're looking for includes why behaviors are occurring, or what seems to be the function of this particular behavior. And there are a few common ones that I want to mention and I want you to think about as you collect data and interview people and analyze your information and conduct direct observations. You can generally put these functions into one of two categories, and they include to attain something or to get something. So I certainly engage in a variety of behavior to get things. And those might include attention. That's a fairly common function for many kids, disability or not, engaging in attention-seeking behavior. Access to materials. I might engage in behavior to get things that I want. If I'm in pre-K, I might kick that kid to get his toy or sort of preferred item. Or access to activities, reinforcing activities, things that I want to be able to do, the computer, the iPad. Or I might engage in behavior to access sensory stimulation. So in particular, many kids with autism engage in repetitive behaviors, or what's technically referred to as stereotypy. And the notion is that that's often a function of sensory stimulation, or I'm accessing some particular reinforcing sensory stimulation. But one of those categories is being able to attain things, to get things. The function of my particular behavior might be to get something from this category here. And then the one on the right includes avoiding things. So instead of trying to get something, a person or activity or material, I might want to avoid those things. The first listed there is aversive tasks or activities. I think most of you would probably agree that there are many situations where children's behavior escalates because they don't want to do what they've been asked to do. Frankly, this is true of adults too. When we design behavior support plans for adults, a common function of behavior is escape avoidance. Nobody really likes to do what they don't like to do, and we're motivated to engage in aberrant behavior to avoid it. In particular, people with disabilities and often accompanying language deficits become very learned at engaging in inappropriate behavior to avoid aversive tasks or activities. So that's certainly a common function. There may be also situations where a person is motivated to escape or avoid certain adults or peers, right? So there may be another person in my environment, a peer who's really loud or is aggressive toward me or makes sounds that I don't like. I've therefore learned that I don't want to be around this person. I'm motivated to engage in behavior that might get me away from him or him away from me. I'm also often, not surprisingly, motivated to avoid sensory or painful stimulation, right? So the person who starts to escalate during a fire alarm, or when things get loud, or sort of a chaotic environment. The kid who might struggle in a store when there's lots of people around or it starts getting loud is motivated to avoid that stimulation. That sensory input is aversive to that person for some reason, and therefore it provides motivation to engage in behavior that makes it go away. And as a consequence, that behavior serves the function of escape avoidance of aversive stimulation. And then other aversive situations that might not fall into this, in particular, sometimes people with autism just find certain words or activities or sounds or sights. Aversive, we don't know why, but this kid doesn't like when he hears the word beanbag. He'll get really upset if he hears the word beanbag, and he's motivated to avoid that. And for him, that's a real thing. And so his behavior serves a function of escape avoidance of that particular word. So these are common functions of behavior: to get a variety of things or to escape or avoid a variety of things. And so the assessment that you do, including a variety of those tools that I've described and will show you in more detail, is really looking to answer these questions, to identify what function or functions your target behaviors serve. So, and again, we'll talk about this in more detail, but what do you do with that information? What's the point of trying to identify that? So I have this kid and I've identified his or her behavior, and I've collected some data and talked to staff and got some direct observations, and I have a good idea about function. This kid's aggressive, and I think the function of this behavior is X. What do I do with that information? Well, there are really two things, or two big things. Obviously, behavior plans can include a lot of modifications and accommodations that might not relate to this, but the whole point of doing an FBA is to use it to design treatment. If your treatment is not based on functions of behavior, then doing the functional assessment was a waste, right? And we know that the functional behavior assessment, it's part of IDEA, it's part of what we do for students with disabilities, so we need to be using it appropriately. And I think that particularly in the last 10 years or so, I've seen people get better and better at doing functional assessments, particularly descriptive and indirect assessments of behavior, but not so much at using those results to design treatment. So I'll often see an assessment that appears on the surface to be pretty good, and then a behavior intervention plan that is totally unrelated to the assessment. And that, of course, defeats the purpose of doing the assessment. So I want to spend a little bit of time really talking to you about how you tie the two together, right? When you do an assessment, it needs to drive the design of the intervention. And so I want to talk about that in a little bit more detail. When you identify the functions, one of the things that allows you to program for is basically to eliminate the consequences that maintain your target behavior or your inappropriate behavior. It says increase there because it also allows you to provide those same consequences for positive behavior, and I'll talk about that in more detail. But one of the things that you do when you identify functions of inappropriate behavior is you try and reduce those, right? So one of the common things that you hear, particularly for school-aged people with disabilities, is if we think their behavior is maintained by attention, then let's ignore their inappropriate behavior. That relates to this first thing. If we think their behavior serves a particular function, then let's eliminate that as a consequence for inappropriate behavior. And I can tell you that that will work, and I'll talk about that in more detail. It will work if you do it exactly right. So it's certainly important to include trying to make inappropriate behavior less functional. We try and make those functions occur less often, less predictably, or eliminate them altogether to the extent that we can, right? For some behaviors, it's not possible to eliminate attention altogether. If I have a particular student who's very aggressive and it's maintained by attention, the truth is I can't really ignore some levels of aggression. I'm going to have to intervene at some point. I certainly want to try and reduce that, but I probably can't get rid of it altogether. If I have a student who I've identified the function as escape avoidance, how might I eliminate that as a consequence? How can I get rid of escape avoidance? If you're participating online, take a minute to think about that. So you have a kid who, when you present a difficult task, you're working on math or reading, he's not he kind of struggles with reading, and it's aversive for him, but we have to do it. And so we introduce this task, and he hits the wall. It's just, he hates reading, and so it just sort of wigs out. Well, I've identified escape avoidance as a function of this behavior. We've done our assessment, and we think that he engages in this behavior to get out of reading. So how do I reduce escape avoidance as a consequence for that behavior? Well, in a perfect world, the best way to reduce that or remove it is to quickly and consistently and accurately make sure that he doesn't get escape avoidance or even a minimal delay, right? That I get reading out and start prompting this student through reading as quickly and efficiently as possible. Now, if you've ever tried to do this before, you know that you can't always do that. That's something that's easier said than done. So it's certainly something that we want to include and that we want to try to implement as a part of this student's program to reduce escape avoidance as a consequence for that behavior. But we also know that in a lot of cases there will be at least some delay, right? If he cuts my ear off and runs out into the street, he's probably going to get out of reading. And there's not a lot that I can do about that. I'm going to stop and, get my ear and put it on ice and go to the hospital. So let's talk about this second thing here. We'll end on that graphic example. So one of the other things that I want to do after I've identified functions is to provide those same consequences for alternative behavior. Right, most of you have probably heard the term replacement behavior. You want to identify replacement behaviors. What do we want this student, what do we want this person to do instead of these inappropriate things? Well, how do we get this person to do that, and how do we motivate him or her to do that? Well, when you do a functional assessment, that's how. You've identified things that are already maintaining behavior. Escape avoidance, attention, access to tangibles, whatever you identify as a part of your assessment, you've identified, in essence, reinforcers. These things already maintain behavior. Forget that your token economy might be fine, and your sticker charts and marble jars and all these things are great. Access to treats at the end of a session, all good stuff. I like that. But this student has already identified a variety of naturally occurring consequences that maintain behavior. In effect, they reinforce inappropriate behavior already. And we can use those same consequences to reinforce things that we want this student to do instead. When we do so, those become functionally equivalent behavior. If I am applying the same functions, I'm now giving more attention to this appropriate alternative. It becomes a functionally equivalent behavior. In other words, I want to provide those same consequences for replacement behaviors. Now, I can tell you that my guess would be most of you have heard this before. You've heard this talked about. The problem is you can't just get replacement behaviors out of nothing. And they will not replace your target behaviors unless they work better for the same reasons or better reasons. I mean, a token economy might work if your tokens have, better payoffs than the target behaviors do. But in many cases, they don't. If I can identify functions and use those to consequate my replacement or my more appropriate behavior, I've identified functionally equivalent behavior, and I can do that in a way that makes this replacement behavior work better. Right? It's more efficient, it's more consistent, it's more predictable. It's an easier way, it's a better way to access this same consequence. That's how you actually replace a target behavior. This, number 2 on here, needs to be the emphasis of most behavior plans, and I can tell you that it's not usually. Most behavior plans focus on number 1 here. They focus on when this target behavior occurs, when this student gets aggressive or this person engages in self-injury, how should we respond to that? Well, let's make sure we don't give him or her much attention, or let's make sure that he doesn't get, the drink that he wants or the popcorn that he's after. That in and of itself is very hard to do consistently and will almost always fail without also including an emphasis on number 2. There has to be a better way to achieve these same outcomes for a person, or you're just not going to get rid of these target behaviors. So when we talk about intervention design, which we will in a few minutes, number 2 really needs to be the emphasis. They both need to be in there, but you really have to put your energy, your resources towards number 2. And as I mentioned there at the bottom in small font, again, you don't want to limit yourself to number 1 here. This is often why planned ignoring fails. And I can tell you that Behavior 101 almost always includes planned ignoring. Many of you have probably had experience with this or even recommended this to other people. So we think that the best way to respond to this particular behavior is to ignore it, to engage in planned ignoring. And in some laughable circumstances, you might even see people say, I'm ignoring you, I'm ignoring your behavior, right? Which of course you're not. The problem with that, as I mentioned before, is first of all, planned ignoring will only work if the behavior is maintained by attention. So unless you're very sure that this behavior serves an attention function and no others, planned ignoring won't work. Even if you do it perfectly, that's not what's maintaining this behavior, right? So don't ignore a behavior that's maintained by escape avoidance or access to reinforcement, or certainly an automatic reinforcement situation. A person who engages in stereotypy for sensory input, it's not for attention. You can't ignore it and make it go away. So it will only work if it's for attention. And by the way, it will only work if you do it exactly right. Can't ignore some of the behavior and attend to it at other times. You have to ignore all of it. And as I'll mention in a few minutes, in most cases, when behavior has a history of being reinforced, when that reinforcement goes away, it tends to briefly increase. And I can tell you when folks try and implement planned ignoring strategies, when they get this, what's referred to as an extinction burst, it's often hard to ignore, right? I might be able to ignore some minor inappropriate behavior, but when that becomes severe, right? When that becomes, taking your clothes off and running out into the street, I can't ignore that. Now I've got to attend to it. And what did I just do? If that's an attention behavior, what did I just reinforce? Escalation. Literally, one little teaching trial. I just taught you, don't mess with the little stuff. You need to take your clothes off and run out into the street. So planned ignoring can be a pretty tricky strategy. It can absolutely work in the right circumstances, but I think in some cases it's sort of over-applied and therefore leads to problems. Okay, so let's talk about conducting a functional assessment. So we've decided that this student has behaviors that are interfering with his or her progress. And so we need to develop a behavior plan. We need to develop a behavior intervention or a behavior support plan for this student. What do we need to do? Well, clearly the first thing that we need to do is define the behavior or behaviors that need to be a part of this. And I won't spend too much time on this, and some of you may have heard before that we need to make sure that the behaviors we're defining are actually behaviors, right? Behaviors are things that we do, things that you can see, they're overt. Things like anxiety, overstimulation, they're real, for sure. I mean, I get anxious, I get overstimulated. But you only know that based on my overt behavior. If I tell you, oh gosh, I'm really anxious right now, or I'm kind of overstimulated, I need to take a break. That's behavior you can see and that you can measure reliably with other people. Other people can see it and you can go, yeah, that's right, Kobe's overstimulated. But things like anxiety and overstimulation, while they're real, they're not actually behaviors. And in fact, it's not wrong to be anxious, it's just wrong to punch my neighbor when I get anxious. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. The first thing I need to do is define the behaviors that I want to address, and to do so in a way that's measurable objectively and reliably. The second thing I need to do is to start gathering information about those behaviors. And this relates back to what I described before with regard to those indirect and direct levels of functional assessment. Certainly the gold standard is functional analysis. And when necessary, that's going to be the best tool to identify functions. But in many cases, particularly for you teachers, the best place to start is with these indirect and direct measures, using questionnaires and interviews and direct observations, and in particular, ABC data collection, getting some very specific and longitudinal information about antecedents and consequences. You need to try and identify some patterns. And in a few minutes, I'll give you some examples of ways to collect that information. Once I collect this, once I get some measurement related to these behaviors and antecedents and consequences, I need to design a intervention program. I need to design my behavior plan, and I'll talk about that in more detail. But certainly that needs to be designed based on the results of my functional assessment. So I do my assessment and design my plan based specifically on those functions. And then of course I need to implement that. Here's the plan. Here's how I want people to do it. And by the way, if you're training on a behavior plan, just reading it, just saying it, unfortunately is not enough. We have quite a bit of research information about training adults to implement plans. The best way to train that is by describing it, demonstrating it, and then letting your trainees implement the plan and giving them feedback on their implementation. I know that creates some barriers for training, but that's what's going to lead to your most accurate implementation. The more sophisticated plans get, the less likely it becomes that people can do it just based on a written plan, even with a description. I know it may seem like everybody gets it when you review that plan in writing, but you'll find that that's actually rarely the case. They need to see it and practice it and get feedback on their implementation. So that's with regard to implementing the program. And then lastly, you need to evaluate that intervention. And that evaluation should come in the form of continued data collection, right? We need to continue to collect data on this target behavior. If it's something we're trying to change, we should be measuring it. We certainly apply that standard to skill acquisition objectives. So when we have a student who we want to talk more, do better at math, or engage more socially, we measure those objectives. So we certainly need some continued measurement for behavior reduction objectives. And then over time, based on that, those responses and that evaluation to intervention, we need to make adjustments. Every single behavior plan should be temporary. And it should be temporary for one of two reasons. Either it's working, right, and the student's behavior is getting better, and over time we need to work on fading those intervention strategies out, fading those supports out so that student is becoming more independent and engaging in appropriate behavior naturally without these extra pieces. Or the second reason would be if the student or person is not responding to the behavior plan. If we're implementing this plan accurately, which you should also measure, by the way, if we're implementing this plan accurately and this student's behavior is not improving, then clearly we need to make adjustments to that plan. Months and months and months are going by and the student's behavior is not changing. We don't have reason to believe that it will. We need to adjust the plan. So in either case, that behavior plan is temporary. And to make those decisions, we have to evaluate intervention over time and in an ongoing manner. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to move to is some data collection tools to collect this ABC information, and I'm going to show you a couple of different ways to do that. This is probably an appropriate moment to break for a minute, so if you happen to be participating online, as soon as this is over, go ahead and move to part 2. And I should also mention, I should have done this at the beginning, so hopefully everybody's still with me. There are a number of documents that are included in this training. a few of which relate to the history of functional assessment. So if you really want to nerd out on this stuff, there's a brief history that I find fascinating. I'm sorry, I just outed myself as a behavioral nerd. And a couple of other pieces of information, some of which are samples for conducting a functional assessment, one of which is a data sheet that I'll review in the next segment. But you should see in the description for this training a link that will allow you to access the folder with all this information, including, by the way, PDFs of all these slides, which I realize now I definitely should have mentioned at the beginning. So let's take about a 10-minute break here, and I'll see you all in the next segment.